Some good news this hour. South Africa's unemployment rate has dropped from 34.5% to 33.9% in the second quarter. Stats SA earlier confirmed these latest figures. And let's get you some reaction or some further insights into those numbers with Hugo Pienaar, and he's the Chief Economist at the Bureau for Economic Research. Hugo, as always, many thanks for speaking to us this afternoon. And let's maybe just start with an overall view of your thoughts on the data that we saw today and the sectors that we saw contributed the most to the second quarter of growth in employment data.
Thank you. Well, the starting point would be to say that you have two Hugo Pienaars on your system. The one is the economist and I'm the labour expert. But let me answer that in any event. Well, of course, any good news such as this is welcomed in a scenario where we have a downward spiral of our economy. And of course, one would hope that when we can trust the figures, we hope that it will continue to improve in the sense of going downwards. And thirdly, we must know that we come from quite a high base. But of course, what this still translates to is we still have 12.8 million people unemployed, the majority of those the youth, and then about 40% would be amongst black females. Now those are concerning figures, and we trust that we will continue to address that. And of course, that the figures will continue to drop, as I've said. Of course, the answer in addressing this, as I've previously indicated, is in the sphere of a social accord, similar to what we had in Ireland in the early 90s. But for that, you need three independent parties, i.e. government, labour and private sector, to sit around the table with no imbalances in power as we have at the moment. Now, of course, if there's a different outcome in the 2024 election, then you may have a different balanced powers playing out in that scenario and maybe have a proper social accord. At the moment, sadly, we still have unprotected strikes, tomorrow's shutdown, and of course that does not help the economy or the employees themselves. And we need somebody really to carry the flag of the unemployed, which we do not have at the moment. And of course, we need to address that, probably as I've indicated. Employers would simply look at the scenario and say, should I create more jobs when there's continued strikes and unprotected strikes, or do we revert back to what Clinton called at the time as a jobless growth scenario? So those are our salaries, our answers, and the sacrifices will have to be made by all those parties that will come into play. And hopefully we will do better. If we look at international rates just briefly, US is about 3.5, Canada at about 4.8, India is, I think, 6 point something, China, if I remember correctly, is around about 8% unemployment. So we're far out of quilt, and we need to address that.
We really do need to address that, but the labour market as such, Hugo, and my apologies for calling you the chief economist from the BER when you're actually from Clifton.
I don't mind that.
You can have both titles. Let's have that for now. But Hugo, on a more serious note, the one big challenge in South Africa's labour market at the moment is the fact that employers, apart from looking at issues of strikes, are also in a very difficult position. So the labour market itself is struggling to absorb whether it be school leavers or university leavers or people who hop around from one job to the other. It's just a really tough time, and I don't know how, whether it's the employer or the employee would be able to navigate this particular environment at this time.
Well, and you're absolutely correct. But in a social accord, of course, all parties must navigate that system. We have employees during COVID making huge salary sacrifices to retain their jobs. Now I mean, that is admirable, but in the context, they managed to retain their jobs. Now, at the same time, we know that employers would argue that they also made sacrifices and the like. But ultimately, we're in an environment where, as I've indicated, the three role players need to get together and address this unemployment rate. We're getting the youth rate increasing, the unemployment rate there. that's not good stats for us. If we look at your pictures there, people just sitting under trees. You know, for every person that gets a job, it feeds 10 more people. It puts people into the position not only to gain respect, but amongst themselves and their communities, but to put bread on the table, which is desperately needed. And of course, then we look at the stats within the country. The worst managed area, i.e. Eastern Cape, has the highest rates of unemployment. And so it goes on. It's really a joint and a concerted effort that we need in order to make a huge change for the sake of everybody in our country, especially those unemployed and the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. We know that the current pressure on work places, in particular at homes, may lead to a further decrease in the rate of the domestic workers' employment rate. And that's terrible because, you know, those are the unsung heroes of our society, as our constitutional court pointed out. And those we will see a drop in those figures as well, in the sense of an increase in unemployment and a drop in employment.
Mm-hmm. Based on your engagements, Hugo, are you having any sense of a look at current legislation when it comes to labour law and perhaps putting the employer in a position that makes it even harder for them to perhaps retrench or restructure their organisations just based on the extremely high rate of unemployment and really the impossible situation for many South Africans? What kind of engagements are you having around a legislation of this nature, if there already isn't one?
That's such a good question. And of course, NETLAC has a duty to continuously consider that. What we do know at the moment is that the current system is not workable. It's not working, and we don't have a system where we could say that a particular piece of legislation either assists or not. We've seen that we've seen more protection for employees during retrenchments and the like. But at the same time, employers will tell you that, you know, the current strike system doesn't work for parties as well. So again, it's a balanced approach. You know, we come from a society and a history where workers were generally exploited, and we come with unions that would come from the struggle mode. And now we're into a different mode where everybody has to change their mindset and come together and say, let's find a joint solution. It's no use both parties playing the blaming game. We really need a joint solution. And I promise you, they did that in Ireland, but in a proper scenario where there was no imbalance of power, as we have at the moment with NETLAC.
Thank you so much, Hugo, for joining us this afternoon. That is Hugo Pienaar, who is the labour expert at Cliff Decker Hofmeyr, joining us this afternoon to talk through the unemployment data, or the quarterly unemployment data that was released today.